Hi everyone, welcome back to my Stuarts vlog. This is episode 5, where we're going to be looking at Charles in the 1640s. Optimistically, I'm going to try and get through both the falling out with Parliament and also the Civil War and what happens afterwards. This is a really involved period of British history. There's a lot of complicated shenanigans between Charles and Parliament. There are many characters involved that we could look at, and lots of big stories about people who are very important. But actually remember that this is a breadth course and that you won't be asked questions about just a handful of years. So it'll always be set in the context of Charles over at least 10 years and the instability of Parliament at that time. So in 1640, Charles, as we saw last time, was manoeuvred into a position where he needed Parliament to come back. And this is the start of the so-called Long Parliament, which actually officially runs all the way through to 1660, even though, of course, it's not called for most of the time of the Republic. When it first met in 1640, there was quite a lot of optimism surrounding the Long Parliament that there would be some sort of compromise, because Charles is in a position now where he kind of needed to work with Parliament. And there was a relative amount of unity amongst the MPs in the Commons against the innovations of Charles in the 1630, the new things that he'd brought in and tried, and the tactics and strategies that he'd used in personal rule, and also against the architects of those innovations, William Laud and Lord Strafford, Thomas Wentworth. They're the same person, by the way, just to clarify that. Now, later on, however, Parliament isn't this kind of uniform monolith that sometimes we just kind of imagine it is. There's a split over those who want to wind the clock back to 1629, 1630, the sort of pre-personal rule status quo be re-established, and those more radical parliamentarians who want to reinforce Parliament's position and establish a kind of a more Puritan England to defend it against the perceived threat of Catholicism. So that split opens out and widens, and you can even see it in the Civil War. When the Civil War starts, about a third of the Commons and, of course, about 2/3 of the Lords side with Charles. On the other hand, of course, 2/3 of the Commons and about a third of the Lords side with Parliament. So it's never quite as simple as Parliament against Charles. There are a greater nuance in it than that. Anyhow, when they first meet over sort of the 1641, 1642 era, the Long Parliament tries to impose restrictions on Charles in 3 ways. You won't be surprised to know. And these are to do with money, power, and religion. So briefly, in terms of money, they tried to make Charles more dependent upon them, or completely dependent on them. They outlaw ship money, they outlaw distraint of knighthood, and they reset forest boundaries back to how they had been before Charles started meddling with them in the 1630s. This means Charles has no further source of income, and they do provide some subsidies for him, but they promise more money for him if, and this is interesting, if Charles will accept John Pym and his what so-called junto, that's Junto, his mates, his colleagues, his allies, as ministers. So basically they're saying, look, if you invite us in and we can work with you, we will give you the money that you need. But essentially they want to make Charles dependent upon Parliament, and they do. Secondly, let's do the second easy one, and that's religion. Religion, actually, people want different things. The Scots want to get rid of bishops. They want a full-on Presbyterian church. And the Puritans want a Puritan Church of England. Moderates in Parliament are happy with the Elizabethan settlement, and Charles says he's happy with that too. So there is an acceptance by Charles that he could wind back a bit. And of course, Laud has been arrested, and he actually appoints a new Archbishop of York at this time, who is someone who was an enemy of Laud, and there is some sort of sense that Charles may be willing to give a little bit on this. However, power is kind of the big thing, and this is where Parliament wants to ensure that it's never in a position again like it had been in the personal rule. And there's also great fear that allowing Charles too much power will mean that he can use it against them. So the initial tactics are to have Laud and Strafford impeached, and that leads eventually to the execution of Strafford in 1641 after a very painful process which ends in an Act of Attainder. This is an act passed by Parliament which basically says we're going to behead. It is the law to behead the Earl of Strafford. Charles signs this only very reluctantly, and actually only after Strafford has said, it's okay, I understand that this perhaps gives you a chance at peace. You should go ahead and do it. I think, though, there's a sense, though, that here that Charles really doesn't forgive Parliament for forcing him into this position. Anyway, Lord and Strafford are pushed out of the way. Prerogative courts are also banned. An unintended consequence of that is that censorship actually is... there's no more censorship because the High Commission Court isn't enforcing it, and that leads actually to the leaking out of all sorts of radical pamphlets and stuff in the Civil War. Parliament then goes further, and in a range of kind of propositions and attempts, Humbolt petitions and whatnot, they try to make it clear to Charles that they want change. I think the most important of these is the 10 propositions, which are published in 1641. These outline really what they keep coming back to, which are that Charles needs to dismiss evil councillors and appoint people who Parliament signs off on. So this Parliament wants control of who Charles' ministers are. That they want Charles to give up control of the army. This was at a time when Charles was going north to sort out the Scots, or negotiate with the Scots, and Parliament was worried that he was going to come back with an army and deal with them. So they want assurances that he is going to give up control of them, and also that they want Catholic advisors, at this point Catholic advisors to the Queen, and Catholic influence over Charles's children's education, his son's education. They want them removed. So get rid of Catholics, get rid of ministers, let Parliament have a say on who your ministers are, and give up control of the army. These are the sort of the key things. Charles was never going to accept these, but the 10 propositions of 1641 really kind of a great example of them happening. What happens then is, over time, a gradual sort of falling out. Parliament tries to assert more of its authority. A key thing is that they try to remove bishops from the Lords, and there's also some rumours that they're going to impeach Henrietta Maria, the Queen, and that leads to Charles entering into Parliament and seeking to arrest the 5 MPs. That's a massive, massive PR own goal by Charles, and it really leads to an irrevocable breakdown in relationship. Charles goes north. Parliament by July 1642 is voting for money to raise an army. Charles himself is trying to raise his own army, and we drift kind of into an unintended civil war. Now that civil war, as you know, lasts from 1642 through to 1646. You don't need to, you'll not be asked like why Parliament win. It's too short a time span. It's not really the focus of our course. You won't be asked to go through the major battles, but briefly there are 3 major battles, and the first one is 1642, Battle of Edge Hill, which is kind of near Birmingham. It's an indecisive outcome, but really it benefits Charles a bit more. It leaves the path open for him to try and get into London, which he almost does, and he's turned back at the Battle of Turnham Green. Parliament is in a slightly dicier position early on, and so it makes this alliance with the Scots, which is quite important. And the alliance is based upon alliance formed by John Pym. The alliance says that if we win, we'll bring a Presbyterian church into England. The Scots then help in 1644 at Marston Moor, where Parliament win the battle, but even more so the New Model Army, which is coming online kind of around then, and is fully trained up by 1645, the Battle of Naseby, which Parliament win decisively. Why do Parliament win? Well, I would suggest to you 3 or 4 reasons. Firstly, that they're better led. That Charles is not a very inspirational leader. He does have talented leadership, and Prince Rupert is the best example of that. But Prince Rupert is more of an individual leader. It's more sort of inspirational figure by charging out, but less of a strategist and less of a leader of men. On the Parliament side, of course, Cromwell makes his name during the Civil War, and Fairfax, Sir Thomas Fairfax, leading the New Model Army, both prove themselves as very good leaders. Secondly, cavalry is a big deal in this war, and by the end of it, at the start of it, the Royalists have the better of that. By the end of it, the New Model Army have 10 regiments of cavalry, each with 600 men, and that's pretty decisive. I should say also that the length of the war is a big deal, that at the start Charles has the experience and the men and the equipment, but the longer it goes on, the greater the swing towards Parliament winning. And actually that's bound up with the 3rd reason or the 4th reason, depending on how you're counting, which is money. Parliament had greater access to London and trade, and was better at raising tax, and could afford to fight the war when Charles was running out of cash. Also, just to note that by the end of the war, you've kind of got four groups emerging, four important groups. The Presbyterians, actually there's a majority of Presbyterians in Parliament who are after a state Presbyterian church. They are, in contrast to the Independents, who don't want a state church at all. The Army, of course, are playing a role now, and the Scots, who also want a Presbyterian church and play a significant role in the next couple of years leading up to Charles's execution. Again, there's a lot to go through and a lot of kind of negotiation and problems between Charles and Parliament in that negotiation after the end of the Civil War. But I think the thing to bear in mind, again, is like, why does it end up with Charles being executed? And it's hard to get past the conclusion that actually it's really down to Charles. He doesn't negotiate in good faith. His negotiations or people present him various ideas at various points in the next couple of years, and he always prevaricates. Having lost the Civil War, Charles is kind of expected to give ground, but when he's asked again to give ground upon leading the army or the militia, and where he's asked to give ground on power over appointments, he again refuses. He's kind of tied to this idea, dyed in the wool idea of the divine right of kings, and he sticks to that right to the end, to, of course, his downfall. Charles actually, during this process, also offers the Scots a way out. He says, I'll implement a Presbyterian church in England. Scots like that idea very much. They like the idea of a proper Presbyterian church in Scotland, removing bishops from the Scottish church in return for returning me back to power. So the Scots actually ally with Charles for a while, but in 1648 they're decisively defeated by the New Model Army in Preston. Preston, actually, if you look at it, is a fair way down England, but I think the sense is that the New Model Army had allowed them to advance that far, and eventually they kind of, when they're at their weakest and furthest away from supplies, the New Model Army attacks them and destroys them. So eventually, and then even after that in 1648, Parliament goes back to the idea that it's going to negotiate with Charles. And it's at this point that people in the army step in and say, look, enough is enough. Charles can no longer be part of the solution. He is part of the problem. And so you get Pride's Purge, which removes basically all the MPs who are prevaricating and are reluctant to act against the king, and just leaves the rump parliament, the leftover parliament, that agrees to put Charles on trial, and then at the end of January 1649 to have him executed. So, like I said, it's hard to get away from the idea that that's down to Charles, really, and his intransigence. But you can also see a role that Parliament plays in there if you go back to the money, power, religion thing, that Parliament are still insisting on change. And these are changes which Charles, as an old school royalist, just cannot entertain. Thanks for watching. Next time we'll go and start to look at the first half, hopefully, of the Republic era. See you there.